Welcome, everyone. Welcome at the Brainwash Festival, which this year is all about doubt and rationality, truth and fiction. My name is Haroon Sheikh. I'm a professor of philosophy at VU University here in Amsterdam and the senior scientist at the Dutch Scientific Council for Government Policy. And I'm here for what, in my view, is going to be seems to be a very special conversation. And allow me to tell you why, at least for me, this is special. For my work, I read up a lot on the newest books on what's going on in science, and in particular, artificial intelligence. That's a topic, I guess it will interest many of you. And I try to read up really what's going on in that field. And in the last few years, really the best book I've read about artificial intelligence has been a book of fiction. It is this book here, The Maniac, which for me was also quite puzzling. A book not about the recent facts, but a work of fiction actually made me think the most about what's going on with artificial intelligence, or more broadly, what technology is doing with us. And as a work of fiction, it really helps us think deeply about what is going on in science and what it's doing with us. So you can imagine how excited I was when the Brainwash Festival called me and they told me that this year we have Benjamín Labatut, and they asked me to do this conversation with him, the author of this book. He is the author of several other books. He was born in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, lived part of his life in the Netherlands, but moved then to Chile. He has written several books. His books have won many prizes. The focus here is going to be on two of his books. The Maniac also was endorsed by Barack Obama, just to give a view of what this book has done. So, Benjamin, welcome here. Or good morning, I should say.
Good morning. Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you here. What the books, and I said the two books we're going to talk about here mostly are The Maniac and another one of an earlier book, When We Cease to Understand the World. Both books really deal with science, and normally when we talk about science, we hear these great stories about brilliant people who rationally think through the next step, and it's seen as kind of coherent perspective. Or maybe we have these stories about mad scientists who are weird and we like to revel in their weirdness and everything. Well, that all happens in these books also, but in the books of Labatut, something else I think happens. What it shows us is really what is at stake when these people who shape our modern world, the people who invented the science and the technology that we all live with, what were they thinking of? What was actually happening in their pursuit of science, their pursuit of knowledge? In his books, at least in my reading of them, Benjamín Labatut shows that there is actually a very profound darkness, or at least a danger, something ominous, deeply connected with this pursuit of science. And what I would like to do in the course of this conversation is explore this. And I think there are many different ways in his books where we see this connection of this great pursuit of science, and at the same time something dangerous, something dark that is manifesting itself. And throughout this conversation, I would like to explore different perspectives on that, hopefully helping us all to think deeper about the world we are living in. I'll do that step by step, and through this conversation also bringing some of the main characters, because that is also really one of the things I really recommend you when reading these books. The characters come to life. All these people who have played a crucial role in creating our modern world, they come to life. So we will pass many of these characters now. So let's start, and for start, I spoke about this connection between what these scientists were doing and something, the destructive force or something dark happening there as well. And here in your book, When We Cease to Understand the World, there is one type of connection, you make it explicit also, that very often in the history of science, the creation of something wonderful, or something that's deeply beneficial to mankind, is very close to something that's also deeply destructive. There are at least two things here I noticed in the book here. One is the story of the German chemist Fritz Haber. And closely in his book, in your book, there's also a story about a synthetic paint called Prussian blue, used in painting. Benjamin, could you I think most people will not be familiar with either Fritz Haber or Prussian blue. Can you tell us about these stories and what they tell us about this connection between great scientific discoveries on the one hand, but on the other hand, a profound destructiveness that's also inherent in them?
Well, I think those two things are somehow inevitably tied together because we live at all times, both in modern times and in recent history and in ancient history, we've always lived in a very precarious balance. We're always like on a bit of a knife's edge. So whenever we do anything that expands our consciousness, whenever we do anything that expands our knowledge, the things that we can do with the world, there is inevitably like a profound upsetting of that order. I myself tend to view these things more in the light of ideas from Taoism, where you can almost not add a single photon of light to the world without increasing our shadow. And those two things are those sort of almost irreconcilable paradoxes are at the heart of literature. Literature is almost one of the ways in which we deal with this. We tend to think of our species as sort of condemned, no, damned, because we're living things. So we know from the moment that we're born that we're sort of in this very, very precarious balance. Science has supercharged that process because more than anything else that we've ever done, modern science suddenly increases our capacity to see things that were formerly very dark to us. So when you say that there's a darkness in science, the darkness is born from the blind spot. The blind spot in science is enormous, just as big as it is in our individual, the way we perceive the world. We have a sort of enormous shadow at the middle of our sight that we don't see and that we're actually incapable of seeing. And it is from that blind spot, that darkness, that these things arise. And so when something very powerful happens, when some discovery like opens up something like what Fritz Haber did. Fritz Haber has been forgotten. He was someone who basically pulled nitrogen from the air. It was almost thought of, it was like a godlike thing, We're going to feed people with nitrogen that's in the air. And to actually do that, in Germany, these factories were built that were the size of an entire city. They would employ 120,000 people. It was something on a level that we had never done. So we got drunk on that, and it's comprehensible that you get drunk on this level of power, right? So after that, he tried to pull all the gold that's diluted in the ocean. Because, that's another of our blind spots. We tend to think that something that worked once is going to work again and again. And reality doesn't really work like that. Oh. So those are the things that I'm attracted to in my books because they present contradictions that are almost unsolvable because Fritz Haber not only fed the world, by not only ensured the conditions necessary for the explosion of humanity, our population doubled and tripled in a couple of decades. It also leads to, he also discovered the gases that were used to kill his own people because he was from Jewish descent in the chambers of the Holocaust. So in his life, you get the paradoxes of genius, cruelty, science, all of these booms and also these sort of horrific uses of the same substance.
Right. I think that's one really powerful story. I mean, on the one hand, this Fritz Haber, he made it possible that we are here with billions of people on Earth. We could not feed ourselves without his discovery. And at the same time, he stands also at the basis of the chemical gases used to exterminate people. Your books are filled with these type of examples. I mentioned briefly the Prussian dye, Prussian blue, paint to make beautiful paintings, but at the same time also at the basis of cyanide. So let's go a bit deeper. So now we see her, and you talked about the blind spot and Taoism, which I'd like to come back to in a moment also. When we talk about this blind spot or this potential darkness that is closely connected with the pursuit of science itself, let's turn to another figure. In your book, you also, in the Maniac, you write about a figure like Kurt Gödel, and when trying to understand him, he was a mathematician, so he was very good at logic, reasoning, and inherent in his scientific thinking, you also, at least it seems to me when I read it, you see something in his scientific greatness. There is also a bit of something dangerous. And you write that specifically by putting, at some point you say, paranoia is logic run amok. So he pursued logic, but somehow it's actually quite closely connected with the paranoid worldview. Can you explain?
Well, I think that I think we're living in a world where logic has run amok. I think that there are several things that have sort of run amok. And amok is a beautiful concept. It's not just a word. The first time I read amok was in writings by William Burroughs, where he would say that people who run amok are possessed by the demon amok, and they go on killing sprees. They go, someone who is amok is someone who has been possessed by amok, and it's people who suddenly, in normal conditions, will just grab whatever is near, a knife, and start killing people that are close to them, and people would scream amok, amok, to sort of warn. And I think that in our modern world, some of our faculties, some of the things that we have chosen to elevate and put in the place of the spirits and other stuff that we killed, with enlightenment, with light, they have suddenly run amok. They are out of control. They have no counterbalance. We are completely lopsided. We have sort of been blinded by the light of our own progress. We have without ever sort of dealing with the necessary counterbalance. Because in the worldview of someone who I would say was sort of pre-enlightenment, you had words to speak of your own darkness. You had actually spirits that incarnated, and they show it to you. You see yourself not only in the light of God, but you are also in constant congress with the devil and with many demons and such things. And where are those things in science? Where are these warning signs of the things that we don't see, that we leave behind? In the case of Gödel, it's fascinating. He's like a personal saint to me, because what he discovered is, among other things, the limits of formal systems. He discovered something that I find absolutely fundamental to modernity and humanity, which is, if you establish a formal system of any kind, there will be things in your system that will have to be either unprovable or that will carry unsolvable contradiction. And it is from mathematics, from this logical search for certainty, for truth, for foundations, for things that this was a project really developed from Hilbert onwards to find firm foundations. Let's put science on, let's find this root of mathematics. And on that, we could build a science that was sort of free from all of these things that we don't like about ourselves, because they introduce chaos, they introduce unknowability, they introduce unsolvable mystery and paradox. And he kind of looks at mathematics at the base of modern mathematics and says, well, from now on, you will either have to accept contradictions, statements, or deal with statements that you know are true, but that cannot be proven within your system. if you understand just that basic idea, you have to sort of reconsider everything you've thought about your rational world order. Because there is a glaring darkness there. There is a sort of, uh, you almost come up with the paradoxes of self-reference that are so common in mysticism and in other ways of thought. So to me, Gödel sort of illuminates this beating heart of contradiction that we cannot get rid of. And for that, we will have to be eternally grateful. The other aspect is paranoia. Paranoia is not just for people who are paranoid. I think that everybody, the way that our brains work, we pile more sense into the world that it has. We never perceive things without adding layers and layers of meaning, connections that may not be there. It's how our minds work. And that is one of the ways in which we deal with purpose. We live with purpose because our brains kind of go on overdrive. We're not sort of perceiving animals. We hallucinate reality. We sort of, and this is something that I don't believe that you can think. I don't believe that you can live without sort of being aware that you're dreaming things and that you're conjuring things, that we are a haunted species. So in the sense of Gödel, his paranoia is not just illuminating. He actually suffered from an excess of sense where he believed, there must be a reason for everything. And if you follow down that road, well, it's hard not to find sort of voices everywhere, right?
Right. It's a fascinating thing you write in your book, indeed. I mean, it's the core of science. Everything has a reason. But in this kind of this shape, it means actually everything has a reason also means there are secret agents. It's a quick leap. And I think also for us in our contemporary age where we are dealing with conspiracy theorists everywhere, it is quite close to a certain scientific spirit, or at least the kind of belief we are looking everywhere for causes. And there might actually be something, paranoid, maybe deep in that scientific pursuit. You touched before on something which I think goes to the core of what in both of your books is, I think, really one of the big topics. You mentioned what Gödel brought in. You have this whole project about the foundation of science, the foundation of mathematics. He proved it's impossible to put this rational foundation on it. There has to be something incomplete in here. And from that moment onwards, science somehow, I think you mentioned contradictions, unpredictability. Things come in that we cannot no longer rationally understand. And I think this is one of the topics in the Maniac. We find at the beginning, we start with the character Paul Ehrenfest. He senses science is going in a strange direction, and particularly because we are now developing science, we are doing calculations about something we fundamentally cannot understand. There is no way to understand. We can calculate, we can make things with all this science, but there is something profoundly incomprehensible, something that goes against all of our common sense, and this is particular in quantum science. This is what happened. So maybe can you? There's a lot of we hear about what quantum mechanics has brought in, but can you, from this perspective, say what is it exactly that happened here in the field of mathematics and physics that is different from science before this crisis?
To me, I've always considered the birthing of quantum mechanics, and not only in quantum mechanics, the things that were happening in pure mathematics around that time. I tend to think about that as as an enlightenment for science, a moment where science suddenly starts to be aware of its own limits and methods. It's a sort of we woke up from a very naive use of our rationality, right? Where we sort of had this blind trust that we could simply think the world into an order, that we could discover all of these things, and that these things would be free from the contradictions, from the irrationality, from the sort of utter mysteriousness that we all feel in our lived lives, right? We had this sort of very naive, and very beautiful project that is still going on, where we are feel destined to understand. And I think understanding is something that covers a very, very small part of our experience as human beings. We are uh, the awareness that things like quantum mechanics brought in was that there were things that simply fell outside the reasoning that we had developed till then. And that we still, to this day, have not been able to come up with a reasoning that can sort of be held in mind from merely a rational perspective, because it presents paradoxes that contradict the basis of those reasonings, right? That a thing is in one sense and not the other at the same time. These are sort of the precious laws of thought. These are things that arise from logic, which we have really stood upon to create our civilization. No? The law of non-contradiction, the laws of identity, all of these things that were sort of, and that everybody inherently works that way. That's how we go about the world, right? Unless you're paranoid or a child, you don't think that your cup is also a dragon, right? But suddenly, in matter itself, no? And then in many ways, in mathematics, these contradictions come alive and become sort of undeniable. So modern mathematics and physics, if you study it closely, it contains so much things that we would simply dismiss as irrational, that people are sort of, they're naive in their thinking that science is simply a sort of casting out magical thinking and stuff like that. The things that we deal with in science, especially in the foundations of science, require you to consider reality in ways that will contradict the way the human mind works, no? And that fall into paradox. And that's why I think quantum mechanics is so special, because it is like a moment where science itself said, oh, if we want to continue this path, we will have to either give up or seriously consider things like locality and the nature of time and how space works. And these are things that it is beautiful to me that there is a human endeavor that questions things that it previously thought were the solid basis on which we could stand. And suddenly that sort of ground beneath our feet is very shaky. And that is, I think we're still reeling from that. We're sort of still recovering from the fact that that thing that we chose to put in the place of God turns out to have many of the mystifying qualities that we thought were not necessary anymore.
So here you're also describing this indeed as something beautiful and fascinating, and I'd like to come back to that, because indeed there is we need to come back to what indeed what this is, this mystery opened up by science or quantum science. But you just described this is something of a break. Science, from this moment onwards, no longer can stand on the clear foundation of our common sense, of our normal experience of reality, of space and time. Suddenly everything becomes a mystery, a contradiction, etc. And one of the things, one of the dangers I would like to pursue a bit more here, this brings us to the main character of the book, The Maniac. The core part of the book is about John von Neumann, famous for a lot of things, the thinker, the person who created game theory and economics, but also mathematics, computer scientist, and all kinds of other fields. There's a quote in your book that I found really fascinating, because from this moment onward, science is no longer guided by common sense, by our normal way of thinking and perceiving the world. You say here, what becomes possible now is a sinister machinal type of intelligence that lacks the restraints that bind the rest of us normally. So in von Neumann, because he no longer is guided by rational common sense, because science is going into this new, different, mysterious type of world, a machinal type of intelligence becomes possible. Can you give an example, or can you explain what you mean with that?
I think everybody feels this very deeply. We sort of, because there are two things. There is this sort of moment of awakening, but the reaction that we took regarding that wasn't, well, we will seriously consider the foundations and sort of wake up to the limits of our thinking. No, we said, well, this still works, so we're going to use it. So a lot of science is still sort of being pursued rationally, while also sort of going back to the attitude that alchemists had, where, well, we know that this works, we just don't know how or why, but we know it works, so we're going to
pursue it anyway. Use it anyway.
And human beings are fundamentally practical. I think everybody sort of, to live their daily lives, has to make peace with things that are fundamentally unknowable. No, our minds work in this way. To do the most simple things, we have to leave out the enormous fecundity of reality itself. So we're doing it moment by moment. I am paying attention to what you're saying, but I'm not getting like lost in the purple curtains behind you. And science sort of did this as well. We said, well, we'll leave these mysteries behind, because we did, von Neumann and Turing and many others, we really did discover something that is probably the most important thing that we have discovered in the 20th century, but that is so common and it's everywhere, so we don't see it. It's like we said, okay, we killed this ancient god, and then the god of computation came alive. And we really should regard it in that way, because it is confounding, we don't know what the limits of its powers are. We kind of thought when it came about that it would end up giving us like video games and like shopping apps. And suddenly we're dealing with the fact that computation may well be, information and computation, probably one of the biggest mysteries we have ever discovered. And without a doubt, the most powerful thing that science has made so far. I think it leaves other things behind. And that is the world that we're living in now. And von Neumann was at the beginning of that, where he could see what would happen to the world through computation. He would see that he was the one who took Turing's paper, which is a hypothetical machine, born from one of the great mysteries of mathematics. Let's never forget that. These are things that mathematics, these are games, mathematical games, right? Like, I tend to look at these characters as if they were sort of monks, thinking about, how angels have sex on the head of a needle. And suddenly from those sort of types of discussion, right? Yes, and they're brought to life in things that von Neumann said, we are going to build this abstract theoretical machine. And that's how we got the Maniac computer. And then people started replicating that computer. And von Neumann warned, he said, wait till you see what happens when every branch of science becomes infected by computation, expanded by computation. And now, right now, we're dealing with the fact that we can no longer trust any image, no video, sound, audio, no text, because we no longer know if they come from reality, if they are man-made, if they have been dreamt or hallucinated up by some algorithm. The power to sort of put into question the ontology of reality and perception is not a minor thing. That is the sort of stuff that I would say magicians and scientists and we're dreaming of. And today, it's become commonplace reality, everyday reality. No, you see it every day. Like my kid or my friends will show me something, and I'll be like, "Well, did you check if that's like real or not?" That is something spectacular that's happening very fast. But what I try to do in the Maniac is sort of trace this madness back to its origin. And the funny thing about it is that if you go all the way back, these leads back to mathematicians crossing fields in 1830, hearing the voice of God. I am not exaggerating. This is where we get Boolean logic that drives computers, that drives the information age. We get it from sort of these semi-alchemists, highly rational, but also highly spiritual people who were dreaming up these things that now we've kind of stripped the spirit of them, and they are now mystifying us, which is very strange how these operations are biting its tail. Well, we've been dreaming up this rationality, and we're headed towards a world that we can really no longer reason ourselves past. And that's why I write these books, because I think that science has it's important to do a kind of demonology of modern science.
Right, right. It just made me think of it. You just said, Trotsky once made this remark. He said, well, religion merely promises to move mountains. Science actually makes it possible for us to do this. And what he meant with that is indeed, there is a deeply religious motive in what science is doing, actually. And it's actually making possible what we always dreamt, and as a thought experiment, now it becomes something that we can actually truly do. I think it's fascinating the way you bring kind of like this spiritual or at least religious experience into it. Now I'm wondering now, you describe people like von Neumann with this purely different type of thinking with his games. He literally developed game theory, some kind of theory about how we can achieve peace by creating enough weapons to destroy the world. And this is like this dangerous type of logic, but it is the pure logic that comes out of his mathematical reasoning. How would you look from that perspective at people we have currently? We also have people like Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Eric Schmidt, the people who are creating our world now. Do you still... how does this perspective lead us to look differently at what these people are telling us, or what their project is?
I pay no attention to people like that. I think that if you take away their money, they would be nothing. And I am interested in people like Demis Hassabis, who's a character
of the DeepMind creator.
Yes, Demis, who is leading Google's AI, has become the leader after the former head of AI quit his job to warn the world that we have created a superior technology, a superior way of thinking, right? This is, we should really pay attention when all the forefathers of AI are quitting their jobs to warn the dangers. And I think this is I know that people are having panic attacks and are scared, but sometimes I think they're not scared enough. And other times, which is, I understand that there's so much hype and so much fear mongering, and there's political reasons for that. But I mean, listen, someone, however powerful, playing with Twitter is not the same as Demis, who was the one who convinced the entire world that AI was something possible during our lifetime.
Right.
And that is what they did with the algorithms that ended up playing Go and that feature in the last part of the book. To me, those games of Go will probably have the possibility of going down in history, because it was the first time that a creation, something that we had created, showed us something about the world that we did not understand. There was some moves in the games of Go played by this South Korean champion, Lee Sedol, against an algorithm that defied 3,000 years of human thinking, deep human thinking. Go is not just another game. Because of the complexity that it has, it's always been considered by the people who play it and by the cultures, China, Japan, Korea, that play this game, they really saw it as a sort of model of the complexity of the world. Right. And one of the most beautiful things about it, the one that attracted my eye, is that it used to be impervious to calculation. You could not reason the game. You had to play with the back of your mind, and this is sort of something that I try over and over to point out in my books, right? That we have this, the back of our minds is so much bigger than the front, Our reasoning capacities are limited. But you play Go with your subconscious. You feel the board. You choose something to do on the board because of how it feels, you know? And we really thought that, and everybody was convinced, especially in the field of artificial intelligence, that there was no way that you could make an algorithm to play like that.
Right.
And then suddenly there was an algorithm that could not only play, it destroyed everybody. It wiped humanity off the board. And that is, of course, to me, when that happened, a sign of the times, of both the horrible potential that this technology has and of the things that we may see about the world and ourselves when we are being looked at by something that is non-human.
Because that's not where it ends. The last few pages of your books, you add another layer to it.
Yeah, that was. I mean,
that's the difference between AlphaGo and AlphaZero.
The original program was trained on human data. So I think everybody's aware of how these things work now. They gave it a bunch of games played by amateurs, semi-amateurs, and then it started playing itself, right? Based on the decisions that human beings had made before. And then they stripped that algorithm. After it had pummeled the world champion, completely destroyed it, they said, well, how about we go one step further and we simply take out all of those human and we let it play against itself from scratch. And it became unbeatable. It was the strongest entity. It could outperform any other chess playing algorithm. It became superhuman and then better than any algorithm in shogi. So, and that is sort of something that showed the potential to go beyond ourselves. And that's how you go back to Gödel, right? It's like, well, we created this formal system, these algorithms. We don't really know what their limits are. We don't understand how they work. We also know that they are profoundly non-human. We also know that they are actually not rational. There is no rationality without a subject, you know. There's no rationality without a being that cares about his perception. No, so there's no mind, there's no reason. There's just these very alien operations, right, that are piggybacking on our creations and spitting back things that we've never seen or thought about before. So it's a very strange relationship, this thing that we've created.
This is really, I think, an amazing insight about artificial intelligence that I came from your book. And so often we really look at it as it does exactly what we're doing, but it's going to do it better. So we just, our operation, our experience, we put into it, and then it does it faster. And so we see it as a superior version of ourselves. And maybe it's going to get, but I think what this insight opens is something much more strange. It is not doing what we're doing. That was maybe what AlphaGo was doing. That was trained on our thinking. But it's now no longer trained on our thinking, our common sense, our experiences and feelings. So the problem is not it's doing better what we're doing. We'd have no idea what it's doing anymore.
Well, I mean, from the point of view of literature, I would say, like, the last time that we when we started writing words down on materials, on clay tablets, when we started writing and sort of language began to operate by itself outside of us, you know, and have a substrate, when our language was no longer confined to our minds and mouths, that was an enormous thing. And this is sort of, I see it as the same version of that, but with mathematics. These are really numbers running on logic-based operations. We have no idea what this thing is because we have no antecedent for it. And the people who are making them are in the blind. They will tell you very openly that they do not understand. And that is, I think, the biggest source of current danger, more than anything else. Because when we built the atomic bombs, we had some of the smartest people, and we had a pretty good idea of what we were doing. Pretty good, not perfect, no. It's always important to remember that when the first bomb went off, there were people there, smart people, Hungarians, who pointed out that we could light the atmosphere on fire.
All right.
There was a non-zero chance of that happening. But at least there was an idea. You see, they could calculate the probability of that non-zero thing happening. Today, we are back to sort of, again, like the layer of a magician or an alchemist, where it's like, we type these things, we get this product, we have no idea of what goes on in the middle.
And that is, maybe then here we are at the title of your other book, What Happens When We Cease to Understand the World. This is the magic we are performing all the time. We are calculating, we are letting these technologies loose. But like magicians, what the outcome of that will be is actually quite, is something we cannot foresee. For the last 10 minutes we have, I'd like to dive back to a few other topics you've touched upon now. Looking at this dynamic of the, from different perspectives, we looked at the danger inherent in this scientific pursuit. And there is this, especially when we cease to understand the world, there are several points in which you reference the high point of civilization. And then at the same time, it also comes very close, in that high civilization, we get very close to an extreme form of barbarity. There's this passage when you write about the flourishing of German culture. It is the same culture that created Goethe, and then you have all these great scientists diving into this new mathematics, new physics. And of course, and this is one of, I think, the great puzzles of the 20th century, how could the creation of Goethe the Goethe-Jugend be followed by the Hitler-Jugend? How could that moment of high civilization at the same time so quickly, Craig, is there maybe something within this pursuit of rationality, within this pursuit of civilization, a barbarity itself? Or is there at some moments you seem to hint that there is a darkness within rationality or civilization itself? Am I right in seeing such a connection in your work?
Absolutely. Anybody who has either studied or sort of works with his own reason, and it's something that writers sometimes do. Not a lot, but sometimes you're you're forced to think rationally. It becomes very readily apparent because there's a darkness to the world itself, and there's a great darkness to all of us. I think in the case, the types of darkness that I try to prod in my books is when reason is sort of blind to its own darkness, which is very dangerous, the excesses of reason, and in my case, von Neumann was sort of the poster child of that. When it's a very dangerous thing for logic not to see its own blind spots, not to see what is leaving out from the world. At the same time, one of the most dangerous things is when madness imbues itself with reason, which is how you get Nazism, right? These were people who were doing crazy shit, thinking that they were being absolutely rational. And that, because we all have the mind's capacity for self-deception is endless. It's endless. I would say that it is, and I think it's something that is almost unsolvable. It is almost impossible not to be tricked by your own mind. It is impossible to lead a life of worth if you live it only through reason. There are many, many aspects of the world that are simply that do not fall into the domain of rational thought. And we have many, many other sort of faculties. So when in the Maniac, there's a line when a character sort of says, well, there have to be sort of strange angels that protect us, from the sort of, from the madness of reason. And that is, I would say that the madness of reason is my preferred topic. It's something that I cannot get away from. I am drawn over and over again by the excesses of our rationality, by projects that want to boil down the world into a system. The world will never be able to be caught in a system. Never. That is the blind spot of science, where we think, okay, what aspects of reality can we turn into symbols and equations? And then we say, well, this is reality. And you're abstracting from something that has a lot that you're leaving out. And then we become convinced, no, the fundamental aspect of reality is mathematics or physics or any other, abstract sort of game of symbols. And they forget that all of these things are born from the minds of people who are abstracting from something larger, far more mysterious and weird. And we become convinced, like we were convinced that Almighty God was up in the heavens, directing things, and that we simply had to follow instructions. We become convinced, seduced by the power of our own abstractions. And if we follow them blindly, yes, we can end up in gas chambers and with hydrogen bombs pointed at each other from submarines and flying up above in the sky, or the idiots that we hear today sort of saying that a technology will automatically produce a better world, which is just simple stupidity, like we could ever sort of solve all problems, and people will no longer have jobs. It's ridiculous because they are simply drawing logical conclusions from abstractions, right? And from limited data. And you're like, but do you understand the blind spot in your own thinking?
So it's not about are you right or wrong, but it's already the operation of abstraction itself where the violence happens.
To me, there is such a profound violence in our abstraction, necessary, but so profound, and it leaves out most of the world.
Right. In a way, it made me think a lot about your books about what Joseph Conrad did earlier about the heart of darkness in colonialism and the pursuit of rationality around the world and showing the darkness there. Maybe for a last question, because I see we're running out of time. In one interview, you said you see it as a compliment when people have a panic attack from reading your books. I think we're close to that moment. We're close to that point now. And it is relevant because I think it has become clear there is really something profoundly to worry about. But still, I would like to see if in the last few minutes we can end up on maybe something of a solution. Sounds so superficial, but something of a different way of getting out of this. And it is something that I do think is present in your work as well. Is it possible that this darkness that we've been talking about over the last hour is not necessarily really darkness itself, but it is because, first of all, in our Western metaphysics, we have first created a form of rationality that it creates its opposite now. But it's because of those Western assumptions. You give the famous example of Einstein saying about quantum mechanics, God doesn't play dice. So only if God first is the person who makes everything rational, everything has to follow exactly according to plan, then we see this world now as something that's dark, something that's full of contradictions. But there are ways of looking to the world that maybe embrace these contradictions themselves as well, inherently. In your book, you give the example of the Hindu goddess Kali, which isn't the Western god of rationality, but that has this darkness, this unpredictability in itself. And obviously, often we hear with quantum mechanics, the idea that everything is a perception, that it is a Buddhist idea. And at the very beginning of this conversation, you referenced Taoism. So is it possible that maybe Eastern metaphysics is a way of getting better to grips with this world that modern science has opened?
Well, I think that if you take science and the Western thinking seriously, you should understand that at its origins there is, Heraclitus, and there are all of these points of connection with these. You do not banish darkness. You do not try and if you shine your light brighter and brighter, your shadows will simply get longer. So you have to do. A lived life requires you to have congress and make peace with all of the aspects, right? And for that, you need these sort of dark gods and dark goddesses, because they are ways of relating, behind the darkness. The darkness veils what is most important,
Right.
What is most important is not the unknown of science, which is what we don't know. What is most important to the way that our brains actually work is what is unknowable, fundamentally unknowable, things that lie beyond the limits of our thinking and that will remain beyond them. The wonderful thing about our consciousness is that we can actually become aware that there are things that you don't understand and that you can't understand. You don't ever actually solve them. They are what we call mysteries,
Right.
and they are
Right.
profound, and they are sort of something that holds us, and you have to hold them. What do you do with contradiction? What do you do with darkness? What do you do with evil? Well, you hold it in your heart, right? In sort of loving contradiction. We don't have other answers for that.
Exactly.
Science
A
will
god
never
or
be.
a metaphysics of darkness, or at least that gives it its place back to reality.
Well,
Thank you
yes.
very much. I'm afraid this is all we have time for now. I think this has been a really wonderful conversation deep into the heart of science. I hope, and I think I'll speak for half the audience, it has been like that. Thank you very much for your time, Benjamin.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
That's all we have time for. Yep. Thank you very much.